Okay, so let's jump right in. There's this huge theory making the rounds that the entire global financial system is going through a massive rewrite. And we're not talking about small tweaks here. We're talking about a potential move away from a world that has been completely built on the US dollar.
So yeah, that's the big question on everyone's mind, isn't it? After 50 plus years on top of the world, is the dollar's time finally up?
That's what we're going to unpack in this explainer. We're going to look at the evidence for this gigantic shift, dig into what's actually driving it, and try to figure out what it all means for you and me.
To really wrap your head around this, you have to understand we're not just talking about currency values bouncing up and down. We're talking about the possibility that the entire rulebook for the global economy is getting tossed out the window.
Now, I know, that sounds incredibly dramatic, but it's a direct quote from our source material, and it really gets at the scale of what we're talking about. And to see why it might be breaking down, we gotta hit the rewind button for a second. So way back, the dollar was actually backed by physical gold. But in 1971, the US cut that tie. The dollar became what's known as a fiat currency, which is just a fancy way of saying its value wasn't based on a lump of metal anymore, but on the world's trust in the US. And boy, did the world trust the US. That trust is what made the dollar the center of pretty much all global business. This whole new system was held together by what you could call an unspoken global agreement, a strong dollar deal that quietly ran the world economy for the next 50 years.
And you can see how it worked right here. It was basically a four-step loop. First, the world agrees to sell crucial stuff, like oil and goods, in US dollars. Then, other countries take all those dollars they earned, and what do? They recycle them right back into the US by buying American stocks and bonds. This was genius because it created endless demand for the dollar and allowed America to buy cheap stuff from overseas and basically live beyond its means. The only problem, this whole system created a massive conflict right inside the US.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. That strong dollar deal essentially split the US economy right down the middle, creating two very different Americas that wanted completely opposite things.
So on one side, you have financialized America. This part of the economy loves a strong dollar. It means cheap imports from other countries, and it means the rest of the world is hungry to buy its main export, which is basically financial products and debt. But then you have productive America, the part of the country that actually builds and grows stuff. For them, a strong dollar is a total nightmare. It makes American-made goods and American workers way too expensive, which encourages companies to just ship jobs overseas, hauling out the country's industrial base.
And that's the whole trade-off right there. If your goal is to rebuild productive America, to actually bring manufacturing back home, then you almost need a weaker currency. It's like an instant discount that makes your exports and your labor cheaper and more attractive to the rest of the world.
Okay, so that's the theory. This built-in tension between two Americas, where one side might actually benefit from taking apart the very system that made the other side incredibly wealthy. But is any of this actually happening right now? Well, yeah, the signs are kind of everywhere when you start looking.
Let's use a great analogy from our source. They call it the shrinking ruler. So think of the dollar as a ruler you use to measure value. Back in the late 1960s, if you worked one full 40-hour week at the federal minimum wage, you could take that paycheck and buy about 1.6 ounces of gold. Remember that, 1 week's work.
So, fast forward to today. To buy that exact same 1.6 ounces of gold while earning the federal minimum wage, you would have to work for 22 solid weeks.
I mean, just let that sink in for a second. From 1 week to 22. It's a jaw-dropping way to see how the value of your time, when you measure it in dollars, has just cratered. Our ruler isn't just shrinking, it's practically disappearing.
And hey, it's not just regular people noticing this. As you can see here, even the world's central banks are changing their behavior. For decades, their go-to move was to stockpile US government debt. But look at the chart. They're steadily buying less of that, and instead are loading up on physical gold. Why? It's pretty simple. Gold is neutral. It's nobody's liability. It's a store of value that sits outside any one country's political drama, which makes it the ultimate safe place to park your money when other currencies start looking shaky.
The famous investor Ray Dalio puts it pretty bluntly here. He's saying the US is creating a tidal wave of new debt, but the number of international buyers who want to soak it up is starting to shrink. And that's a fundamental crack in the foundation of the entire old system.
All right, so let's bring all this high-level stuff back down to earth. A world order that's cracking, a dollar that buys less and less, and even central banks are hedging their bets.
What on earth does any of this mean for your actual life and for your money?
Well, it really looks like we're at a fork in the road. Path number one is a sort of managed decline, a slow burn of inflation. The government makes borrowing easy, the dollar gets weaker over time, and the price of assets, things like stocks, houses, maybe even Bitcoin, goes way, way up in dollar terms. The big danger here is that your salary, your actual purchasing power, just can't keep up with the rising cost of literally everything.
Now, path 2, that's a whole different story. It's a much sharper, much more painful shock. This is where global investors suddenly lose faith, pull their money out of the US, and force interest rates to skyrocket, which could make asset prices just fall off a cliff. It would be a really brutal, really fast recession.
But here's the absolute kicker, the most important takeaway from all of this. It doesn't really matter if we get the slow burn of inflation or the sudden shock of deflation. Both paths seem to favor people who own assets over people who just earn an income. This whole transition, no matter which way it breaks, could make the gap between asset owners and wage earners massively wider.
Which leaves all of us with one final and pretty unavoidable question. In a world where the very idea of money seems to be changing, and where that financial ruler we use keeps getting shorter, how are you supposed to prepare for whatever comes next?